This is a free audiobook recording of Pride and Prejudice in the public domain, brought to you by the audiobook Novelist.
Chapter 7. Mr. Bennet's property consisted almost entirely in an estate of $2,000 a year, which, unfortunately for his daughters, was entailed, in default of heirs male, on a distant relation, and their mother's fortune, though ample for her situation in life, could but ill supply the deficiency of his. Her father had been an attorney in Meryton, and had left her £4,000. She had a sister married to a Mr. Phillips, who had been a clerk to their father, and succeeded him in the business, and who had a house in Meryton, the town where he lived, and where the girls were frequent visitors. Their aunt was always glad to see them, and it was a great advantage to them, since the Miss Bennets had few opportunities of seeing many people unless they visited in the neighborhood, or went to Meryton. The eldest of the girls frequently walked to town on fine mornings. It was only a mile away, and they enjoyed the exercise. But sometimes, when the weather was less favorable, or when they went shopping, they would go in the carriage. The youngest Bennet daughters, Catherine and Lydia, were particularly eager about visiting. Their minds were more vacant than their sisters', their attention less caught by books or study. They were fond of dancing and the officers, and that's what occupied most of their time and conversation. Mr. Bennet regarded them as silly and frivolous, but his wife was proud of them and frequently boasted of Lydia's high spirits. "Lydia is such a favorite with Colonel Foster. You know," she often said, "she'll make a fine match if she plays her cards right." It was through the militia's arrival in Meryton that new characters were introduced into the story. The regiment had been quartered there over the winter, and the presence of so many officers had created quite a stir among the ladies of the town. Mrs. Bennet was particularly thrilled, and encouraged her daughters to walk into town as often as possible, especially in hopes of running into someone eligible. One morning, when Jane was invited to dine with the Bingley sisters at Netherfield, Mrs. Bennet had a plan. "It is likely to rain, and then you must stay all night," she said. "You had better go on horseback, but if it rains, my dear, it will be uncomfortable. No matter, the gentlemen must have their share in the matter. Jane must go on horseback, and if it rains, so much the better, it will give her a reason to stay longer." Mr. Bennet smiled silently, but Jane, trusting her mother's judgment, and seeing no harm in the suggestion, went on horseback. As it happened, it did rain, and Jane, having caught a cold from the damp ride, sent word the next day that she was unwell and would remain at Netherfield. Elizabeth, concerned for her sister's health, resolved to walk the 3 miles to visit her. Though her mother objected, at first, Elizabeth persisted and arrived, muddy but full of concern. The Bingley sisters were polite but surprised at Elizabeth's appearance. Mr. Bingley, on the other hand, received her with real pleasure, and Jane was grateful for her company. Mr. Darcy was also present, and while he disapproved of her muddy petticoat, could not help admiring the energy and devotion of her character. Her eyes were brightened by the exercise, he thought, and her face, though flushed by the walk, held a lively expression of kindness. Miss Bingley, however, was less charitable. She looked down on Elizabeth's manners and dress, and made several sly remarks about her wild country behavior. But Elizabeth was undisturbed. She stayed with Jane through the day, and it was finally decided she would remain until her sister recovered. Chapter 8. At 5 o'clock, the 2 ladies retired to dress, and at 6:30, Elizabeth was summoned to dinner. To the civil inquiries which then poured in, and among which she had the pleasure of distinguishing the much superior solicitude of Mr. Bingley's sisters, she could not make a very favorable answer. Jane was by no means better. The sisters, on hearing this, repeated 3 or 4 times how much they were grieved, how shocking it was to have a bad cold, and how excessively they disliked being ill themselves, and then thought no more of the matter. Their indifference towards Jane, when not immediately before them, restored Elizabeth to the enjoyment of all her original dislike. Their brother, indeed, was the only one of the party whom she could regard with any complacency. His anxiety for Jane was evident, and his attentions to herself most pleasing. and they prevented her feeling herself so much an intruder as she believed. She was considered by the others. She had very little notice from any but him. Miss Bingley was engrossed by Mr. Darcy, her admiration of him being the more openly acknowledged whenever he was present. Her manners were not conciliating, and her remarks were often unjust or unpleasant. Mr. Darcy, meanwhile, continued to make silent observations. He was divided between admiration of Elizabeth's wit and energy, and a deep consciousness of her inferior connections. He thought her manners were not those of the fashionable world, yet he was drawn to her sense and spirit. During the evening, the ladies and gentlemen separated. Elizabeth was left alone with Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, who tried for some time to entertain her with idle compliments and remarks about balls and gowns. Until Mr. Darcy joined them, Miss Bingley took this opportunity to engage Darcy in a discussion of women's accomplishments. "I am afraid, Mr. Darcy," she said, "that this adventure has rather lessened your admiration of our heroine's courage." "Not at all," he replied. "She exerts herself to assist her sister and displays affection and intelligence. I find such qualities admirable," cried Miss Bingley. "How shocking it is to have such bad health. I always pity anyone with a weak constitution." "What a pity it is, Miss Eliza, that your sister should be so ill." "She bears it very patiently," said Elizabeth, "and her illness, I hope, will soon be over." They discussed reading, conversation, and womanly virtues. Miss Bingley attempted to display her own taste and cleverness in front of Mr. Darcy, but only succeeded in annoying Elizabeth and embarrassing herself. Darcy, though cool and composed, clearly valued conversation with intelligence and principle over flattery and display. When Miss Bingley mentioned Elizabeth's muddy walk again with disdain, Darcy quietly remarked, "I cannot boast of knowing more than half a dozen young ladies in the whole range of my acquaintance that are really accomplished." Elizabeth looked at him with surprise. "Are you so severe upon your own sex?" she asked. "I never saw such capacity, and taste, and application, and elegance as you describe united," he replied. Miss Bingley smiled and took credit for herself, but Elizabeth found no pleasure in the conversation and was glad when the evening ended. Chapter 9. Elizabeth passed the chief of the night in her sister's room, and in the morning she had the pleasure of being able to send a tolerable answer to the inquiries, which she very early received from Mr. Bingley by a housemaid, and some time afterwards from the two elegant ladies who waited on his sisters, with a great deal of contentment. Elizabeth joined them for breakfast. Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst appeared anxious to show politeness to their guest, and their brother, indeed, was most solicitous. But Darcy said very little, and when he did speak, it was often with formality and gravity. Not long after breakfast, a servant entered the room with a message from Mrs. Bennet. She had arrived with Lydia and Kitty to check on Jane, and had asked to see Elizabeth in the breakfast parlor. Miss Bingley was quite put out by the arrival, and Elizabeth was embarrassed, but she went to her mother at once. Mrs. Bennet had come in high spirits, confident that Jane's illness had served its purpose, and that she would stay long enough at Netherfield to secure Mr. Bingley's affection. She was over-talkative, overly familiar, and seemed determined to make a strong impression. Elizabeth, trying to manage the awkwardness, persuaded her mother not to come upstairs to see Jane, who was still resting. Mrs. Bennet reluctantly agreed, and Mr. Bingley soon entered the parlor to offer her his greetings. His polite and attentive manner pleased Mrs. Bennet greatly, and she made no effort to hide her delight. "You are a charming young man, Mr. Bingley," she said, "and I am sure you will fall in love with one of my daughters. Jane is so modest and good-natured." Elizabeth blushed with shame at her mother's forwardness, while Bingley responded with kind smiles. Soon, the conversation turned to Jane's health, and Mrs. Bennet took the opportunity to talk loudly and freely, ignoring Elizabeth's gentle hints to be more reserved. When Mr. Darcy entered the room, Mrs. Bennet eyed him with curiosity and launched into a fresh string of remarks about Netherfield, her daughters, and the local officers. "I dare say Mr. Bingley never had such a charming place as Netherfield before," she said. Darcy bowed silently. When Sir William Lucas arrived shortly afterward to inquire after Jane, Mrs. Bennet immediately hailed him and involved him in a conversation that only increased Elizabeth's discomfort. Sir William, always courteous, attempted to smooth things over. "What a delightful party you had at the last ball," he said to Bingley. "We are all looking forward to the next." "Indeed," replied Bingley. "I am thinking of giving one here soon." "Splendid. And what a beautiful dancing space you have." Mrs. Bennet took this as a signal to speak again of how well Jane and Mr. Bingley danced together. After a few more attempts at social climbing and matchmaking hints, Mrs. Bennet, Lydia, and Kitty finally departed, leaving Elizabeth mortified. "What is Mama thinking?" she thought. "How could she speak so freely in front of Mr. Darcy?" Back in the drawing room, Miss Bingley began making sly remarks about the Bennet family, hoping to align herself with Darcy's sense of superiority. "What a family you have, Miss Eliza," she said. "I don't know how you stand it." But Elizabeth, though inwardly wounded, replied with calm dignity. She would not defend her mother's behavior, but would not let Miss Bingley's mockery pass unchallenged. Mr. Darcy, for his part, had listened in silence, while the impropriety of Mrs. Bennet's remarks confirmed some of his reservations. He could not ignore Elizabeth's grace under pressure. And so the visit ended, with each character feeling differently affected by the events of the morning.